Next is session 2. Sino-U.S. cooperation and competition after U.S. elections. Associate Professor at the University of Tokyo, Professor Sahashi Ryo, will be the moderator. I would like to pass the microphone to Professor Sahashi.
Thank you. As has been kindly introduced, my name is Sahashi from University of Tokyo. So I will be serving as the leading commentator. So to be the moderator as well as giving my own comments. Now, we had such illustrious the panelists having wonderful presentations, and from different angles. As President Trump will be once again in the helm, what would happen to the world? I'm sure you were able to understand what may be coming for us. And we had Professor Nye, Ambassador Armitage, and Dr. Hamre. All these people who have come all the way across the Pacific. We also have Dr. Rash Doshi and also Dr. Bonnie Lin have also come all the way as well. So we have heard such distinguished presentations, but the people in the audience might be a little bit exhausted. So please enjoy a little bit of a game of opinion poll. So you have the red paper and the blue paper. This is a sort of icebreaker time. So I would like to, first of all, ask 2 questions. My first question is, now, before the election, those of you who have thought that Donald Trump will win, please raise the red paper. Those of you who thought that the Democratic administration will continue, Ms. Harris will win, blue, please. This is a big hole, but this is just like a Kohaku Utagassen, the big, the end of the year event of the concert by the Japanese singers at NHK. So those of you who said, I have predicted Mr. Trump will win, so red, please. True? Is it true, really? Thank you. So you were a good predictor. Now, I would like to ask another question and then move into the panel discussion. Now, with the Trump 2.0 happening, the peace and the prosperity of the world would be maintained and become even better. Please raise red. And those of you who are very anxious and a lot of uncertainty, you are worried, blue, please. So as far as I see it, a little bit over half will be blue, meaning that you're a little bit worried. So that seems to be the opinion survey of the Japanese public, that they have a good foresight, it seems. Now I would like to begin the panel discussion. Our panel is to focus on the Sino-U.S. relationship with the Trump administration once again coming to being. What would happen with the relationship with the U.S. and what would happen to Taiwan and to the alliance as well as to the international situation. Now, there are 4 major questions that I would like to raise, and I would also like to ask the audience and collect the questions from the audience as well. Let me start with the first question. So, I'm moving into the very central core question. What will be the China policy of the Trump administration? Under the Trump 1.0, economy and trade were the main issues. On the other hand, under the Biden administration, security and economy has been connected and combined, and economic security endeavors have been placed a lot of importance. And under the Biden administration, science and technology policies, like Infrastructure Act and Chips and Science Act, and there were a lot of screening as well as export control being tightened up. And whereas for Trump administration to come, what may be the Chinese policy? Would it be once again the trade war? That's to say, trade deficit will be emphasized, or the economic security and such policy view will be continued, meaning that continuity may exist. When I look back in 2010, towards 2020s, at the end of the Trump administration, there was very strong the criticism of the Communist Party, the governance, as well as human rights issue over to China in 2020. So do you think that this will also once again become issues? To be fair, since I am also the speaker here, so I should give my own view. Economic security may not end. But on the other hand, trade war could once again erupt, and ideological attack on China could happen. That means all of them, all of the above may happen. So I would like to hear the view of the experts. The first to come is Dr. Doshi, who is seated in the middle. Dr. Rush Doshi, up until very recently, has been with the Biden administration. He was working inside the White House. He has acquired a doctorate from the Harvard University. He joined the think tank community, but in the Biden administration, he was the commander, the command imposed for the China policy. The new China program under the Biden administration is now being led by Dr. Doshi. So my first question to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and it's great to be here with all of you. I actually have learned something already just from the red and blue card exercise, so grateful to all of you for sharing your opinion. Let me just start by saying that when we consider a Trump administration, there is a fundamental question. Will we see the China policy of President Trump or the China policy of President Trump's staff? And those are not exactly the same thing. We saw in the first term that President Trump's staff had a sort of competitive approach on China that I think in broad brushstrokes was consistent with the sort of bipartisan consensus that had been emerging on China policy. And you saw tough actions on economics and technology, on human rights, maybe a bit more ideological emphasis in a Republican administration than a Democratic administration, but generally, again, a kind of bipartisan consensus approach. But President Trump himself had a different approach. His approach was more transactional, more based on, I hate to say it sometimes, his own individual unpredictability or self-interest, and it sometimes undermined the approach of his staff. So as we consider a second Trump term, again, the question is which Trump policy are we going to get? The variability is enormous, all the way from sort of Cold War style confrontation on the one hand to potentially efforts to strike big deals on the other hand. So the staff in the Trump administration has a lot of influence. We know in the first term, for example, that it was his staff, in part driven through bipartisan motivation, that put export controls on Huawei and ZTE, two Chinese companies. But President Trump promised President Xi he would lift the export controls on ZTE. So that undermined the competitive approach of his staff. So that's the challenge that we face. That's one example, but there are many others. Take the trade war as well. I think President Trump's staff was very focused on a trade deal that would address Chinese excess capacity or industrial policy at the time, now perhaps more excess capacity. But what we got instead was a trade deal that didn't really take on those issues, that essentially forced China to purchase American commodities, but didn't necessarily solve the deep structural problems in the trade relationship. So again, tension between the staff perspective and President Trump's perspective. Now, we know the staff can make decisions that will have long-term implications for U.S.-China relations. A pretty good example of that is on the tariff policy itself. The fact of those tariffs, you can argue about their economic impact, but they created uncertainty about the wisdom of putting supply chains in China. And then you look at other efforts by the Trump administration staff that don't get as much attention, but are critically important. For example, there was an executive order on information technology, the ICTS executive order, that the Biden administration used on electric vehicles to keep them, essentially, Chinese-made vehicles out of the United States. So regardless of President Trump's own views, the staff can make decisions that might have long-term implications for the U.S.-China economic relationship. And if you look at the staff that has been picked so far, Senator Rubio as Secretary of State, Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, Elise Stefanik as the UN ambassador, If you want to see a competitive approach on China, these are reassuring picks. But at the end of the day, President Trump is still the boss, and we don't know how much maneuver room they are going to have relative to his own specific perspective on key questions of policy. I think I'll end with just maybe two broad observations on economic and technology. The first one is that on the tariff question, in the last session, you heard, I think correctly, that you should take seriously that President Trump will want to levy tariffs on China and possibly on allies and partners. However, how he does that still matters. We don't know exactly how he's going to do it. Will he, for example, immediately raise tariffs on China on the first or second day? Or will he threaten to raise tariffs and gradually phase in the increase over time? Or will he make the threat and then immediately turn to negotiation? All of these are possibilities. His own staff has different views. Very recently, Scott Bessent, a leading candidate for Treasury Secretary, came out and said publicly that he didn't want to see us return to the tariff regime of the last 100 years. But of course, President Trump has praised that tariff regime as exactly what he wants to create. So who knows exactly what will happen? There will be a competition to define what exactly the tariff approach looks like. And I suspect that nobody can tell you today with great certainty what it is. Final point on economics. The Biden approach, as our moderator correctly noted, involved significant investment in industrial policy, in American manufacturing, and a renaissance and reindustrialization. The question is, will the Trump administration continue that approach? Some members are very passionately in favor of that approach, but others have raised concerns about, for example, efforts in the United States to bring back semiconductor manufacturing. They've raised concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact on reindustrialization. They've raised concerns about American infrastructure investment. So all of these formative elements of Biden-era industrial policy, the question is, will they be continued and deepened in the Trump administration or not? And that matters because it's not just a question of what the U.S. does to China. It's also a question of what the U.S. does at home and what the U.S. does with its allies and partners like Japan. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Now, can I also invite Dr. Bonnie Lin? At Yale University, she has acquired her doctorate, and then she moved to Pentagon. She was a person in charge of China and Taiwan, and she has gone through the RAND Corporation, and she is now Security and the Senior Fellow for Asian Security and Director of the China Power Project at the CSIS. That's a wonderful website, so please look at them.
And I'd like to echo what Rush said. It's an honor to be here, and I've also very much already learned quite a bit from the audience as well as the prior panels. So I very much agree with what Rush said in terms of we will need to differentiate between the positions of President Trump as well as his staff. But perhaps I believe that we will see, even if you look at the positions as a whole, a much tougher approach towards China across the board. And that includes not only in the economic space, but also on the military space, as well as domestically within the United States. And I think here it will probably start with, in the Trump administration, a more sharper defining of the China threat. So I just want to share with you a bit of what we've already seen defined by some of the folks that President Trump plans to appoint already. Senator Rubio has already defined China as a threat that will define this century, and that China doesn't just seek to be the most powerful nation in the world, but they seek to reorient the world. Similarly, we've seen Representative Waltz label China as an existential threat, and he's already said that the United States is already in a Cold War with China. So these types of framing will go much more beyond how the Trump administration characterized the China threat during the first term, in which they were still very cautious in not using the term threat. And there were terms about revisionism, there were terms about China being a long-term strategic competitor, but I think I would expect in the second Trump administration to be a much sharper framing and a sharper focus on China. I would also note that when we look at the Trump administration's potential approach toward China, obviously there's a lot of different approaches out there, and I'm not sure that, I think the economic tariffs, the trade war might be critical component of it, but I'm not sure if that's the only major change or major component. And I think here it might be useful to reference Representative Mike Waltz's 5-part strategy to prevent war with China. I'm not sure how much of that will be translated into actual Trump policy, but given that he could become the next national security advisor, I think it would be interesting to point out. The first thing that he mentioned was to arm Taiwan faster. The second is to provide clarity to U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific that U.S. will stand strong with them. And in particular, he mentions the Quad, as well as strengthening relations with India. The third he mentioned is making major investments in the U.S. military to modernize aging ships and planes. The fourth is disciplining and bringing back supply chains to the United States. And then the fifth is protecting U.S. intellectual property rights. I think when you, in a second Trump administration, my sense is if you look at they will try to redefine again the overall nature of U.S.-China relations. I think it will be more focused on competition. I think there will probably be very little room for cooperation or dialogue, and we should also expect significantly less people-to-people exchanges. I think Russia's already covered a bit on the economic side. The only thing I would add to, in addition to the tariffs that were mentioned earlier and by Rush, is that we shouldn't forget that President Trump and I believe also Senator Rubio as well as Representative Waltz have proposed revoking China's permanent normal trade relation status. And if that is revoked, the tariffs wouldn't be as high as 60%, but they could be quite significant, up to 40-some% on certain types of materials, certain types of U.S. exports. We should also note that President Trump has also vowed to withdraw from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And we also have seen comments that he has made with respect to moving manufacturing, to prevent China from moving manufacturing to Mexico. And this would likely involve some modification to the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. Beyond economics, though, I think on the military side, we should expect more investment in defense, more U.S. military activities, both FONOPs as well as Taiwan Strait Transits, as well as general military exercise in the region. And I think we'll talk about this later, but I do think that if we have folks like Senator Rubio as well as Representative Waltz driving some of this relationship, we will probably see, at least on the security side, a continued desire to strengthen alliances and partnerships. I will note that one area that will be quite different from the Biden administration will be an intensified effort to counter domestic threats within the United States. I'm not saying that the Biden administration didn't do that, but we will see a reemergence of the China Initiative likely. We will also likely see a lot more aggressive regulations to limit Chinese ownership of vital infrastructure. And we'll likely also see potentially more limits on Chinese visas, as well as restrictions and monitoring of Chinese activity within the United States. So across the board, a lot more intensification of the approach toward China.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. Bonnie-san and also Dr. Lin, Dr. Doshi, both of you saying that it's going to be pretty tough China policy. The third speaker, Professor Takahara. He needs no introduction from me, but after learning at the University of Tokyo, the obtained degree in the Sussex University, coming back to Japan, he is the authority on China research here in Japan, the driving force. And last fiscal year, he retired from the University of Tokyo. He is currently serving as a distinguished visiting professor at Tokyo Women's Christian University. So, Professor Takahara, you just heard from our two colleagues about the China policy in the Trump 2.0. And then I'd like to ask you the second question first. But first, listening to our two distinguished participants, how do you look at the China policy? Professor Sahashi, thank you very much. We have simultaneous interpretation, so I would like to speak slowly. As I listen to two of my colleagues, pretty tough, hardlining China policy is expected in the second Trump administration. As I listen to your comments, yeah, I could understand where you are coming from. There is one issue, because the Trump administration will last for 4 years. What would be the possible changes during that period? So I thought about that. Let's see. As remember the Trump 1.0 in the very first year, relationship with China was good because North Korea was the common shared issue. Xi Jinping, 2017. Then there was a Communist Party Congress, and he wanted to stabilize the relationship with the United States, even changing their policy towards North Korea. I mean, China became tougher on North Korea, but trying to stabilize the relationship with the United States. That's year one. But year two, there was this economic issue that became apparent, but including the security matters. Pretty tough China policy was conducted. But January 2020, economic trade arrangement or agreement was concluded after a very tough, long negotiation process. But concerning those economic issues, again, deal making was possible. And deal making, I think, is possible because things that can be solved by money, you can solve them, but the real issue is security, ideological confrontation. On these matters, President Trump, how interested is he? We don't know, as we already heard. But going forward, now cabinet is appointed one by one, but some people would be pretty tough against China. And China, compared with 4 years ago or 8 years ago, be it South China Sea or East China Sea or somewhere surrounding Taiwan, the actions are actually intensifying. That's a fact. Can the United States and China compromise in the second administration? I think that would be the focal issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, as you have said, the track record of the Trump 1.0, which ended 4 years ago, for economy, with the 2 years being taken, that the economy has been boosted. But because of the COVID, U.S.-China relationship have soured and worsened. So, what was the relevance of economic deal? That may be the question that China may have. So my second question is, with China being in the protagonist seat, with the hardline policies undertaken by United States vis-à-vis China, what may be the response of China, on the other hand? As was seen in the past, in order to mitigate the Trump, will negotiation and transaction be continued, or it could be done in parallel. But for the past several years, various legislations that have been put in place in China, and be it the economic, the control and regulations, they now have means to counter the United States. So do you think that China will try to countervail the United States? What about the diplomatic approaches to the other countries, for example, vis-à-vis Europe and vis-à-vis Japan? Do you think that China may find a way forward? So what may be the response of China? May I ask Professor Takahara first to respond? Trying to predict China, my prediction is always wrong. So let me give you and share with you my thoughts at this moment in time, basically thinking that China's policy vis-à-vis United States will not change that much. That is my understanding. Let me try to explain. The external policies of China, there is a core and centerpiece for that. This is long-term strategic competition needs to be won by China. This is the long-term goal of China. To borrow what Xi Jinping has been saying, up until now, China was a land power, but going forward, will become a sea power. So land power and sea power to be combined, a true world power. That is what China needs to aim for. That seems to be the words of Xi Jinping when he have discussion internally within the Communist Party to so win the victory against the United States, and be it political system, economic system, and financial system, or be it security system. that what has been already established should be made into the past, and Chinese systems will be put in place. That seems to be the long-term goal. But in the short term, paradoxically, that they need to have stable relationship with the United States. That seems to be the wish of Xi Jinping, because in order to win in the long-term competition, China needs to grow and develop further, which means that in order to continue to grow, for now, China needs to work in a friendly manner with the United States, to have stable relationship and not to have that much of a storm being ratcheted up with the United States. With the long-term victory in the competition with the United States, there's another important point in diplomacy. There are, I believe, 4 basic points. The first pillar of the 4 pillars is, for now, in the short term, they need to stabilize its relationship with the United States. The second pillar is to support Russia. In order to have strategic competition with the United States, Russia is very necessary for China. And the third pillar is Europe and Japan. The relationship with these parties need to be stabilized and, if possible, to be developed, and if possible, with Europe and Japan and the United States to drive a wedge between the United States and Japan and the United States and Europe, because China is supporting Russia. So I don't think it is easy for China to become friendlier with Europe. And as China is engaged in military activities around Japan, Japan is going for strengthening alliance with the United States. But China is not giving up, trying to stabilize relations with Japan as well as Europe so that they can further develop a better relationship. And the fourth would be strengthening relationship with the global South. And in external policies of China, if you sort out, those will be the 4 major points. And I'm sure China will continue these 4 major policies.
それではアメリカからの
Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask the question to the 2 of you from the United States. So, Dr. Doshi, as I asked, how China would react. First, concerning the negotiations with the United States, are they really serious about negotiating with the United States, China? What would be the real points in the negotiations? Biden administration, I think climate change was the issue, but this time, what would be really the focal point in the negotiation? And outside of the United States, what would be the reaction from China? So, Dr. Doshi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Let me first begin by saying I have very little to add to the prior answer, which I think covered China's larger strategic ambitions clearly. But maybe going back to the first question for a moment, because I think it bears on the second question. And the first question was, what Trump-China policy will we see? And that helps determine what China's response might actually be. In the first Trump administration, remember, as I said, his staff had one approach and he had another. He was more interested in deals. So just go issue by issue. On, as I mentioned, technology, he put export controls in, his staff put export controls in place. He tried to remove them. On trade, his staff wanted an approach that would address China's industrial policy programs. Trump was content with a deal that would just sell commodities. Then take human rights. His staff was very strong on human rights issues in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. President Trump thought those were less important than a trade deal. And then you get to allies and partners. Of course, his staff was very strong supporters of American alliances, but President Trump had a more transactional view. So whether we get the staff setting or the Trump setting matters for the question of China's response. I think China will seek to find a way to to bring out the deal-making Trump away from the tough Trump. They're going to want the deal-making Trump. And that's going to be hard to accomplish. But I think I'll make 3 broad points about how China might be looking at this administration. The first is going to be that, China in many ways has been in the last decade, more than a decade, pursuing its own effort to decouple from the United States and from the West and also from American allies like Japan. Before the United States even put export controls on Huawei, China had given, President Xi had given a speech in 2015 saying that China's biggest national security risk was its dependence on the control of advanced technology by Western countries. That's before President Trump was even elected. At the time, Barack Obama was still president. 2015, that speech. So the approach that they have had has been longstanding. And the difference between now and 2016 is they've made more progress. That leads to a second point. What kind of progress has China made in being able to respond to US economic and technology action? Well, we've seen China pass its anti-foreign sanctions law. We've seen China pass its unreliable entity list regulatory regime. And we've seen China pass new export controls through an export control law as well. All of these give China ways of creating pain for the United States in the case of a major economic and technology trade war. So already we've seen some of these used. And so now the question, I think, for all of us is, what is China's decision-making calculus going to be on using these kinds of tools? And I think their calculus basically falls in three buckets. First, if they think the United States will escalate in response to Chinese escalation, then they might be more cautious. So a good example of this is the trade war in the first Trump term. China initially tried to match President Trump's tariffs, but then when President Trump escalated further, they weren't so sure they could keep up. So in that case, they were afraid of further escalation. There's a second possibility. They may think that the US will back down, perhaps because of concerns about inflation. So they will then feel if they escalate, the Americans may not try to match them. A good example of this might be China's decision to go after US companies like Micron a few years ago in response to US export controls on semiconductors. Maybe they thought they could get away with that because there wouldn't be further escalation. Another good example is their efforts to go after critical minerals like graphite and gallium and germanium and antimony. I'm not sure if those translate easily. But those minerals are very important for production, and China has a regime to govern them. But there's a third form of decision-making that could be in the minds of China's leaders. It may not just be a question of, will the US escalate? It may not be a question of, will the US take it? It might be a third question. Is the US seeking to fundamentally undermine China's economy and system of government? And so I think it's possible that a very heavy and high tariff regime on day one puts Xi Jinping in a very awkward position. He loses face, and he might have to respond. He may have to respond in a big way, otherwise his own domestic position may be eroded. He has to show strength. And so that might mean no matter what their calculus is, no matter what they think the US will do, they feel they have to push back. So these are the three logics of Chinese response. Let me end very quickly by simply saying on the diplomatic side, I think it's possible that we will see China, as they did in the first term, try to build ties to other countries that are concerned about the US position. It's already happened a bit with Japan, with India, and with Europeans. We're seeing China's charm offensive. And I think this approach is rooted really in what I call the Davos play. Because remember, when President Trump was elected in his first term, President Xi went to Davos and sort of, in a completely ridiculous way, claimed that China would be the champion of globalization because America was retreating. I think we'll see that same kind of posturing, not just on economic questions, but also on security questions like Russia, Ukraine, and maybe even the Middle East, where they will try to show that they are responsible players and that the United States is irresponsible and withdrawing. And finally, they'll continue their aggressive engagement in the global South, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world to sort of outmaneuver the United States. So I think those will be the diplomatic plays, but I think the economic and technology question is really central, and that's why I spent so much time on that answer. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. And now, can I turn to the Boni? Now, if you could be a little bit shorter and brief, because I will give you longer time in the next question, please.
Okay, thank you. I largely agree with what Professor Takahara as well as Rush mentioned. I guess one thing that I think in Rush's answer that I agree with more is I do think China will probably retaliate if we attempt significant tariffs or significant sanctions. And so that's where the one area where I slightly disagree with Professor Tahara is I'm not sure China's overall goal is to stabilize relations with the United States. I think that would be ideal, but I do think that to the extent that China feels that it is under threat and under pressure, China will likely escalate. I think we need to remember that the Xi Jinping that President Trump will be dealing with in 2025 is one that is much stronger than the one he dealt with in 2017. At that time, Xi had just consolidated power for about 4 or so years. And we also need to note that, as Rush mentioned, China has a much larger toolkit to use. In terms of the immediate steps that we should expect from the Chinese side is, I do think that there will be desire from China to reach out at the highest levels to have a Xi-Trump meeting, just like what we saw in Mar-a-Lago, because to Rush's point about trying to differentiate what is Trump's policy on China versus that of his staff. It'll be very important from the Chinese side to understand what does Trump actually think and be able to circumvent the noise that's coming from his potential advisors. The last thing I'll point to here is that we will also see China continue to look for what is the one or two main interlocutors that really represent Trump. And here, I think it's interesting to bring in some of the folks who wouldn't be called China hawks, like Elon Musk and some of the other billionaires that are helping to advise Trump. And it'll be interesting to see how those different tendencies play out, because on one hand, you have these billionaires who have different stakes in the U.S.-China relationship. On the other hand, you also have these more traditional China hawks in the foreign policy side.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. Now, let me move on to the next question. I mean, we still have a half of the allocated time remaining. I think you are all concerned about two things. Now, one concerns Taiwan. Will there be a contingency? Will there be a conflict in the next 4 years? How about Japan? How about alliance and international order? Can they withstand that Taiwan contingency? So let's use these blue and red cards. In the next 4 years, concerning Taiwan, those of you who think there might be a conflict, show red. In the next 4 years, with the Trump administration, the war can be avoided in the next 4 years. Blue card, please. Thank you. Relatively speaking, more blue, close to 70% blue. In other words, U.S.-China policy, while there are some twists and turns, but the war in Taiwan can be avoided. I think that was the reaction. Well, it was not what I expected, but that was your thought. So more specifically, let me ask the next question. For Trump administration, what does Taiwan mean for Trump administration? So we would like to start from there. From the previous administration, about the Taiwan policies, the Trump administration started fortifying this. Biden administration developed them even more. On the other hand, President Trump himself, President Trump himself, it doesn't seem to be so interested in Taiwan. In the next 4 years, what will be the policies vis-a-vis Taiwan? For instance, strategic ambiguity. Will it be reviewed? Strategic ambiguity, will it be reviewed or not? So that's one question. On the other hand, China and Taiwan, how will they try to respond to that? Not just China, but on Taiwan as well. We would like to have your comments. As for Taiwan, Ambassador de Armitage, Professor Nye, as they discussed already, concerning Taiwan, purchasing of weapons, that has already been proposed by Taiwan. How will Taiwan respond to this? What do you think? But maybe, since we are talking about the Trump administration, some people talk about Taiwan as a card. I personally don't think that's likely, but making Taiwan as a Taiwan card and negotiation with China, if that's what you are expecting, please share your thoughts with us. In a nutshell, with the second Trump administration, do we see the higher risks of Taiwan contingency, or are there fewer risks of Taiwan contingency? So, Dr. Lin.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with the last question you posed. Is there a higher risk of contingency in the Taiwan Strait in the second Trump administration or not? And I guess I would say that there's a general higher risk of a crisis in the Taiwan contingency, regardless of which administration we're looking at. And this, I think, links to two major factors on the Chinese, and particularly because of calculation on the Chinese side. One is that we're seeing that China's capabilities, particularly military capabilities, have been increasing over time. And as we get closer and closer to 2027, China will have more confidence in terms of its military capabilities to not only engage in a quarantine or blockade of Taiwan, which China can do today, but also in an invasion of Taiwan. And that frees up more options to think through different contingencies. The second point I would make is I would say that China is much less tolerant of the current Taiwan president, William Lai, than his predecessor. And we're seeing this tolerance will probably grow more and more thin over the next couple of years. And in my discussions with some of our Chinese interlocutors, there's a lot of worry around 2027, which is the last year of President Lai's first term, if he has a second term. But there's a lot of worry that if he only has one term, that there could be lots of desire on Taiwan's end. This is a Chinese worry that Taiwan could escalate or engage in different types of activity. So generally from the Chinese perspective, regardless of whether we have a Harris or a Trump administration, I think there is more of a risk as well as more of an appetite potentially to think about using more coercive measures. In terms of the Trump administration's policy towards Taiwan, I agree with what was mentioned earlier. I think there's a lot of uncertainty because we have one sense of President Trump as a candidate, having generally less concern about Taiwan, not really mentioning Taiwan to the same extent as his advisors. But we also know during the first Trump administration, he left quite a bit of leeway for his advisors to really strengthen the relationship with Taiwan. So I would say that we'll need to deal with this tension, but I do think in terms of United States using Taiwan as a card, I'm not sure if that will be as easy to use because I don't think China wants to trade Taiwan for anything. And I think China would be hesitant to agree to anything with President Trump if they believe that this could be reversed in the next administration that isn't a Trump administration. I also think that there is uncertainty in terms of whether we will see anything related to strategic clarity. Now, Senator Rubio as well as Representative Walz have argued for strategic clarity. But again, I don't think that's where President Trump is. We also see both Rubio and Walz advocating for more international space, more deepened defense cooperation, more arms sales to Taiwan. I think those are likely more possible because it doesn't rise to a level of clarity, which could trigger more red lines from Beijing, and that may be where Trump might weigh in more. So I think below a certain threshold, you might see the Trump staff having a lot of leeway to deepen the relationship with Taiwan, but above a certain threshold, you might see President Trump weighing in a bit more.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. Now, I had the slight sigh of relief. Now, Professor Takahara, the floor is yours, sir. Let's see. For one thing, from China, when China looks at Taiwan, so let me start with that approach. For Xi Jinping, the continent unification with Taiwan, that's really the dream of the China. So to realize that China's long-cherished dream, it's very important. The unification of Taiwan is something that he wants to realize, undoubtedly. So putting Taiwan under Beijing's control, based on nationalism, the unification of the Chinese race, so that's another meaning of this reunification. But as I was mentioned before, so to win the strategic competition against the United States, that's a major challenge for China. So given that, as a sea power, getting into the sea, and then very important the foothold, to have the kind of a foothold, that strategic sense, that's the one of the meaning in their attempt to unify Taiwan. The first island line, they are already mentioning that the first chain of islands, and strategically China is at a disadvantage because the chain of the first island,
圏下に我々はいるのだ
first chain of islands,
とって言いました。
So that is what is being discussed internally. So the unification with Taiwan, the strategic relevance is being seen by the Chinese leadership, it seems. That is our assumption. But on the other hand, if they are to unify with Taiwan, for Xi Jinping, is that the most important issue for him? Is that the top priority issue for him? I don't think so. Thinking about top priority for Xi Jinping is to maintain his regime, his own administration, to be prolonged. What makes it difficult for prolongation of his regime? Highly risky action can never be undertaken. So it may be true that Chinese capabilities are increasing and improving. That is true. But on the side of Taiwan, for those parties who do not want any change of status quo by force, by strengthening its deterrence capability, the risk level would be kept high by the other countries and other parties, and that could deter China's invasion of Taiwan. That is my view. Thank you.
それでは
Thank you so much. I now would like to ask Dr. Dosh, but Dr. Lin and Professor Takahara, as I listen to both of you, the Trump administration, how are they going to respond as the Trump administration concerning Taiwan? One additional question I received from the audience, not just the war, but for Taiwan, some kind of activities to make them accept the unification with China, forceful, peaceful unification, if I could use the expression. In some sense, they are already doing this. Is there an effective measure against that kind of a forceful, peaceful unification, if possible?
Well, thank you for that very easy question. Maybe I'll start with just talking a little bit about where I think the significance of this question. We all understand the significance of the Taiwan question. You know, there's an estimate from Bloomberg Research which suggests conflict in the Taiwan Strait would cost the global economy at least $10 trillion. And that's just the supply chain disruption. That doesn't include actual economic warfare and kinetic strikes against each other. It would cripple the global economy, probably a setback greater than the Great Depression if there were really war in the Taiwan Strait. So this is an important issue. And that's why I think it's very good, because this issue is so important, that the Trump administration has completely different views internally on how to handle it. There's no consensus. We know, again, this goes back to the point I made earlier. The staff has one perspective and the president has another, but even the staff is not united. Let's talk about the staff. As Bonnie mentioned, members of the staff that have been named, that will be appointed, Waltz, Rubio, Stefanik, they're strong supporters of Taiwan. And they'll be inclined to keep with the bipartisan view that the United States must invest heavily in deterring China from taking any military action in the Taiwan Strait. They'll continue that approach. But as you know, and as you heard on the last panel, and President Trump has said things like Taiwan should pay for its own defense, that the U.S. is basically an insurance company, but we're not collecting premiums from Taiwan. Alternatively, he has said that the United States is like the mafia, providing protection, and Taiwan should pay the way that someone would pay the mafia in the United States for protection. So those are the examples that he's used, which all suggest that the American commitment is highly contingent on what Taiwan does, at which point, of course, strategic ambiguity as we know it becomes much less tenable. It looks much more like retrenchment than it looks like clarity. And that could be emboldening. We know, many of us know, that many in China have asked eagerly, is it possible that we might be able to take action in the Strait and President Trump would acquiesce? Now, to President Trump's credit, there's a flip side of this question. Because remember, 4 years ago, many in China were worried that President Trump might use military force in the South China Sea ahead of the election. So his unpredictability also contrasts, it runs against his penchant for deal making. So there's elements that are likely to embolden China, and there's elements that may also deter China. We don't know how it will all work out. Probably for China, that question will be decided over time based on what happens in the administration. I would just argue further that we're already seeing interesting steps by Taiwan to accommodate itself to this new reality. And the announcement that, well, the reporting anyway, that Taiwan might seek a $15 billion arms sale from the United States is based on the idea that if they have a big headline sale, President Trump will feel better about Taiwan. And that's a very smart move, and I suspect that it was driven largely by political players in Taipei who understand the Trump administration, and they very cleverly have decided that this is the best way to advance their agenda. And they're right, it's a smart move. The only problem with that move is that it's the US side that is asking Taiwan to do something that isn't in Taiwan's interest. It'd be better if Taiwan spent the money not on the F-35, not on a lot of ships that will sink quickly, but on the asymmetric capabilities that are important for Taiwan's defense. And this $15 billion amount might crowd out other spending that Taiwan could make, making Taiwan less secure ahead of a date like 2027, which is an important date to plan around. So overall, there's clearly this short-term trade-off as Taiwan tries to accommodate itself to President Trump. It may take steps that hurt it in the long term. Let me end by just saying one final element here. The audience, I think 2/3 of the audience thought that things might be stable. There wouldn't necessarily be conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and 1/3 had a different view. And I was reminded of Deng Xiaoping's quote about Mao Zedong, which was that Mao was 2/3 right and 1/3 wrong. And I think maybe the audience also was 2/3 right and 1/3 wrong. I agree that the risk of conflict in the near term is not high, but it's growing, as Bonnie mentioned, because the trends are that China's capabilities are increasing and the political instability in the cross-strait relationship is increasing because Taipei has leadership that Beijing doesn't trust, and Beijing conversely feels the need to respond or to preempt decisions made in Taipei. I think there was a window of time when there was a sort of implicit political bargain where maybe the US and Taiwan were restrained more politically after August 2022, when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. And in response, China was more restrained militarily. But that ended in May 2024 with the election, the inauguration of President Lai, and China doesn't trust him. So even if Taiwan is restrained now, I'm not sure China will be restrained. And so quite apart from Trump, as Bonnie mentioned, we're seeing this cycle in the Strait of escalation and mistrust, which is very concerning. I don't think that's going to lead to conflict, but I think it will lead to more military exercises that will raise concerns around the world about commerce through the Taiwan Strait.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Time flies so fast. But from Dr. Lee and Dr. Doshi, something reassuring have also been mentioned. But of course, nothing is clear what may happen going forward. We have to be always watchful for the coming 4 years. So lastly, perhaps 30 to 40 seconds each for the panelists. So what is the role of alliance going forward? That is the question I would like to ask. So one final word for this, because Japan, when we look at the Taiwan Straits and the US-China, the confrontation, what may be the expectation of Japan? So very brief and simple answer, starting with Professor Takahara. So whatever the issue may be, America the Great to be maintained, you need to have collaboration with your ally. That is very important. Vice versa, looked from the China's position that the United States has alliance network to try to weaken it by herself, by the United States. That is to say, if the Trump administration underestimates the relationship with the allies, that is like shooting your own foot. That is how China may look at the United States.
I agree. China has said that the biggest benefit of a Trump presidency is that he might alienate American allies and partners. So the most important thing the United States can do is work closely with its allies and partners. I'll end by simply saying that regardless of President Trump's approach, Japan will have many friends in Congress. And I'd note that we just saw the conclusion yesterday of the Senate elections for leadership, and we saw John Thune succeed. And that's an individual who I think will be a strong supporter of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Congress will continue to be a strong supporter of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And the members that Trump has selected to staff his administration will also be strong supporters of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So there are plenty of folks in the United States who understand the importance of this relationship for security, for shared approaches on economics and technology, and I think those people will be helpful in the period ahead.
I very much agree with what my two predecessors mentioned. I would just note that looking at the current selection, both Senator Rubio as well as Representative Waltz, reading through what they've written as well as what they've tried to pass through Congress, there's no indication that the two of them don't support alliances and partnerships. And if you look at them, they're particularly strong on partnership in the Indo-Pacific, with the Quad, with Japan, with the Philippines, as well as with India. So I think at least in terms of U.S.-Japan, I think you should see both of them as very strong advocates. I would note that I think one thing that we will need to pay attention to is President Trump will ask allies to do a lot more on the economic side, and to what extent can our allies and partners balance the economic demands versus the security demands? And here I think you might want to, given that we're expecting 4 years of a Trump administration, you might want to understand that maybe some of the demands from the economic side, and particularly for increased defense spending, is from the U.S. perspective, from President Trump's team's perspective, to increase our overall defenses. So I think this is where I think our allies and partners will have to work with the Trump administration a bit more.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. So many issues have been elucidated in this panel. I have difficulty summarizing all the things, but to a certain extent, I think you have felt relieved, and also you have felt a little bit anxious as well. But last but not least, I would just like to emphasize the following point here. Staff are important, not just President Trump. We have to pay attention to that. And the U.S.-Japan, we have this alliance, the networking of the people, connection amongst people, it's so important. Ambassador Armitage and Professor Nye, for more than 20 years in various international fora, I have been taught by the two gentlemen. And as young leaders, CSIS Pacific Forum had that young leaders meeting. So in various ways, the U.S.-Japan relationship has been built not just on the top levels, but also on the youth level as well. And we can expect much from them. Dr. Doshi, Dr. Lin, I had a chance to meet with you on various occasions. And our generation and the next generation needs to be connected. And regarding Mike Waltz about the U.S.-Japan network, for about 8 years, he is already part of the network. And in this network, for Japan, for Asia, I think he has developed his robust view. And it's really not the summary of this session, but not just this kind of a symposium, but through various fora and meetings for U.S. and Japan to continue to have a strong alliance and to maintain the strong international order, the communication and the network of people, and formulating the policies will be important. It's not the meaningless even in the Trump administration 2.0. So with this, I would like to conclude this, and please thank all the members of the panel with a round of applause. Thank you very much once again. Please leave the stage please join me with a great round of applause.